Welcome back to Mishnah in Depth for Masechet Meilah. This is session 2. This week we're going to go through chapters Gimel and Daled. So this first Mishnah is also in its entirety. It appears in Masechet Temura. So those of you who have been following along with Mishnah in Depth will have already covered this. If you haven't, welcome to Mishnah in Depth. There are certain animals which, when they have been separated, set aside, consecrated as a karban chatas, they have to eventually be left to die naturally in some way rather than being brought. And there are a few different situations that produce this. 5 situations in particular. We're going to start with 3 of them. And this Mishnah is being brought because by the time you get to the end of the Mishnah, it will be giving us information about these animals and their status with respect to the concern over violating Meilah, misuse of temple property. So, Vlad Chatas, if you set aside an animal as a Chatas offering and then it gives birth to offspring, then that animal that is born, Utsmuras Chatas, if you set an animal aside as a Chatas and something goes wrong, it's gone, it's lost, it's stolen, you don't know where it is, you set aside a replacement animal for your Chatas obligation. So now we're talking about that replacement animal. The Chatas Shemesu Ba'ala, or the actual animal of a Chatas that was set aside and it didn't go anywhere, but the owner went somewhere. The owner has died, and so their obligation is no longer extant, but the animal is still consecrated and can't be used for normal purposes. So all 3 of these animals, Yamusu, we allow them to die of natural causes. They are put into a pen. You just leave them alone. She'avrash nasa, let's say you consecrated an animal and then it becomes too old to offer. If it becomes older than a yearling, it's not supposed to be used for a karban chatas. Or visha avda, if it's lost, vishanimtse spalasmon. This is not a case where it was lost and you created a replacement animal for it. Rather, in this case, it was lost and then you found it, but it was found with a flaw, a blemish that means that you cannot offer it as a karban anymore. So there are 2 possibilities. The first possibility is im misha kipru babal. Let's say you found it and it was after you already consecrated a replacement and brought it, and you already effectuated your atonement. So now you have a karban that's consecrated with nothing to do. So in that case, tamus, it just you leave it alone. It's consecrated but has no purpose or obligation to which it's connected. The Ve'ena osa tamura, there's no need nor ability to designate a replacement for it on a result of its blemish, because the chatas that needed to be offered already was, while this one was missing. V'lo nanim, nonetheless, you shouldn't derive benefit from this animal. V'lo malin, but if you did, you didn't violate Meilah, because this animal is not currently Kadshei Hashem. So even though you're not supposed to benefit from it, and it's in this state where you're supposed to let it die of natural causes, you don't violate Meilah if you benefited from it. You don't owe back an asham and the additional fifth. The imad shelo kipra ba'olam terad shetistaiv, the simacher, the avibida me'acheres. If you find this animal at a point where you haven't yet brought a karban to fulfill the chatas obligation, and so there's still this obligation extant, and you've now recovered the animal. So Kati points out the next line here, Tera achetistoy v'tzimacher, sends us back to the earlier case, the first 2 in the second line of the Mishnah, Avrash nasav avda, not nimtzeis balasmon, because we're going to see in a second, the first step is to let it get him up. So in a case where the animal was lost and then recovered, you let the animal graze until it naturally develops a blemish in the course of events. And at that point, it can no longer be brought on the Mizbeach. And then you can sell it and use the funds to purchase another animal. With those funds and that animal will have the Kedusha, the consecration of the original animal that became problematic. For the animal that already was found with a mum, you obviously do not need to let it graze to develop a mum. That one can be sold right away. and you use the funds to get another one. In either case, whether the animal was found with a mum or whether you let it graze until it develops a mum, both are capable of making a tamura, a substitution animal, consecrated in place of them. And both of them, if you benefit a pruta from them, you are chayav for Meilah. Mishnah Bet is going to talk about the consecration of the three animals that a Nazir, a person who makes a Nazir vow and then completes it, is obligated to bring. The Nazir brings at the end of their Nazirus, as part of the procedure and the ritual for completing it, they bring a chatas, an ola, and a shlamim. So if you set aside funds to cover the cost of those animals, hamafir shmos l'naziruso, those funds, lo nanin v'lo molin meishahin ru'in lavo kulon shalom. If you set aside the money, this Nazir set aside the money and he simply said, this money is for the karbanos I'm going to owe later, at the end of my Nazirus. But he didn't specify which money was for which karban. So, first of all, you shouldn't have general benefit from that money because it's consecrated. However, if you did have benefit from that money, they're not subject to Meilah because since he didn't designate which karban was specifically for, you could claim that they're all for the shlamim. The shlamim offering is not kadshei Hashem. The meat is eaten by the person bringing the karban. And so since the money could be argued was all intended for the shlamim, there's no din of Meilah by this money. Let's say the Nazir now dies and this money is sitting around that was set aside. So hayu stumin, if they were just generally said, this was the money for my karbanos and they weren't specified which was for which, yiplu l'nedava, the money just goes into one of the donation boxes at the Beis HaMikdash, which pays for the Olas Nadava that people bring year round. And so you can just give the money to the Beis HaMikdash. However, Hayu Mefarashim, if he specified which money was for which karban, then you have to do different things with each set of money. So just like the chatas would be left to die, essentially this money is left to be useless. The phrase used in the Mishnah is they go to the Dead Sea. Essentially this money has to be thrown away forever and never spent. This is what you do with any chatas that's been set aside or any money for a chatas that's been set aside where the owner has died. Again, with those funds, you shouldn't get benefit from them because it's consecrated, but it is not Kodshei Hashem per se, and so there is no din of Meilah if you benefit from them. Demei Ola, the Ola is a little easier. Yaviu Ola, you take the money that was going to be for a completely burned offering, and you go and you bring a voluntary completely burned offering, and it all works out. Demei Shlamim, the money that was going to be used to purchase the shlamim animal that would be eaten by the owner. So you can also bring a voluntary shlamim, yaviu shlamim. However, unlike a, let's say, standard shlamim, you have to eat them in a narrower time frame. V'ne'achalim niyom echad, says Kahati. Lo kechol shlamim hane'achalim l'shnei yamim v'layla echad. Any other time you brought a shlamim, normally you would be able to eat it for 2 days and the intervening night. But since this money was separated for a Nazir shlamim, this shlamim has to be eaten just for the first day and night, according to the consecration of those funds. However, the einan tu'unin lech, normally when you would bring this shlamim of a Nazir, there would be a lechem, a bread offering along with it. However, the pasuk says, v'nasan al kapei hanazir, that bread is intended to go on the outstretched palms of the actual Nazir. In this case, you don't have a Nazir. The Nazir has passed away. So despite the fact that these shlamim are consecrated and have to be eaten like a Nazir shlamim, there is no bread brought with them in this case. Now we have another observation Mishnah where Rabbi Yishmael is going to set out a dichotomy here and help us understand that things proceed differently throughout the process of using different items that run out of the Beis HaMikdash as waste, one of which is the blood of the animals, and the other of which is the wine that's poured on the Mizbeach, along with the karbanos. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Hatam Kal B'Schilaso V'Chamer B'Sofo, His general observation is blood starts out less stringent and becomes more stringent. The poured offerings of wine starts out more stringent and becomes less stringent. So what happens? Hadam batchila ein ma'olin bo. The blood of an animal that's been collected before you do the zrika satan, before you throw it on the mizbeach, you cannot violate meila with it. Yatzal nachal kidron, but then once it flows out of the Beis Hamikdash into the valley next to the Harabayas, now you can violate meila with them. Why? Because what you would think that this is runoff and not useful anymore actually is an asset of the Beit HaKabayis. This is something owned for profit by the Beis Hamikdash. Let's look in Gahati. Yatzal lenachal kidron, shekain shiari adam and ishpecham al yisod mizbeach hayotzi misham lenachal kidron. All the blood that was poured at the base of the mizbeach ran out into the valley of Kidron. Moal and Bo. This is a Mishnah from Yoma. What happens with that blood? The blood that would be poured on the western corner of the on the western side of the mizbeach, and the blood that would be poured on the southern side, they intermingle in the drainage pipe, misarvin ba'ama. The yotzin lenachal kidron v'nimkarin lagananin lezevel. It runs out into the valley, and the Beis Hamikdash sells it to gardeners and farmers as fertilizer. Moalin bahen. This is in the Mishnah Meilah as well. You can have it, but you have to pay. You have to pay the Beis Hamikdash for this fertilizer, this nutritious blood that you're going to use to help your crops grow. So again, Yatzal and Nachal Kidron Moal and Bo. Before the blood was thrown, you couldn't violate Me'ilah, but now that it's outside the Beis Hamikdash, it is possible to violate Me'ilah because it's property of the Beis Hamikdash. Whereas on the other hand, the poured wine offerings, from the moment they are designated, they are consecrated, and you can violate Me'ilah with respect to them. But once they run out from the drainage tube that's built into the Mizbeach, their mitzvah is completed, and it is not possible to violate Me'ilah with respect to them any longer. We previously talked about the ashes that are removed from the big outer Mizbeach, the large altar where animals are offered. Now we're going to talk about the ashes from other spots in the Beis Hamikdash. The ashes that are cleared away from the burning of the incense on the inner Mizbeach, and the ashes and wicks that are cleared from the burning of the lamps of the menorah, lo nanin v'lo ma'alin. Their mitzvah is done, so it's not possible to violate Me'ilah with respect to them because they're not Kodshei Hashem. However, you are not supposed to derive any benefit from them. Why is this different from the ashes that are on the larger Mizbeach? Kati says, it is possible to violate Me'ilah with respect to the heaped up ashes that are on the animal altar. There's a commanded line of what to do with those ashes. It's there for a reason, and as long as it's fulfilling the commanded line of the pasuk that to put the heaped up ashes there, it retains its purposeful kedusha. However, there's no such line about the burned remnants in the menorah or on the Ketores altar. That's why it's not possible to violate Me'ilah per se, even though you're not supposed to benefit from those remnants. The two kinds of birds that we bring for karbanos, one of them, the tar, has to be a certain age old to be brought, and one of them, the ben yonah, must be below a certain age to be brought. So, in the case where you have a tar that's not old enough to be brought yet, or a ben yonah that has aged out, it's now too old, they have been set aside, they've been consecrated, but because they cannot be brought as Kodshei Hashem, there is no din of Me'ilah with respect to them. Lo nanim, however, v'lo mo'alim. Rabbi Shimon takes issue with this in half of the psak, because he says it is still possible for one of those to be Kodshei Hashem. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Torin shelo higiyas manan, mo'alin bahem. Uvnei Yonah sha'avars manan lo nanim v'lo mo'alim. Whereas the Ben Yonah is now aged out, it can no longer be brought on the Mizbeach. Therefore, it's no longer possible to violate Me'ilah. Rabbi Shimon believes that a Tor, which is not yet able to be brought, but will be able to be brought at some point in the future, remains within the category of Kodshei Hashem, and you can still violate Me'ilah with it until, for whatever reason, it's no longer fit to be brought. Let's say you slaughter an animal, a hekdesh animal, and you find, let's say it's a bird, and you find in it an egg that was already formed. Or if you slaughter a female animal and you find milk in the udder that was already there. So these are not considered part of the animal. So it's not possible to violate Me'ilah with respect to them. But again, it is improper to benefit from them. You just don't violate Me'ilah. This is the case with animals that are consecrated to be brought on the Mizbeach, because in that case, you have consecrated only the animal or the bird itself. That is the part that is, by definition, the Mizbeach offering. That is the carbon. Anything you find within it is not the carbon. However, if you just consecrate something so that it becomes property of the Beis Hamikdash, an asset in their ledger, hiktish tarnagoles molin ba'ubevetzasa. You have consecrated that whole, let's say, chicken, and so it and whatever is inside it have all been consecrated to be property of hektish. Therefore, if you find an egg inside that chicken, let's say you slaughter that chicken and you benefit from that chicken, you have violated Me'ilah with respect to that chicken. Let's say that chicken fell victim to some misfortune, but you derived benefit in the amount of a pruta, of a penny, from an egg that was within it. You have violated Me'ilah. And this is not just by, for instance, eating the chicken egg, right? So if you consecrate a donkey to the Beis Hamikdash and then you use it to pull your wagon, you are in violation of Me'ilah with respect to that donkey. Similarly, you've consecrated this donkey and you milk it. You can't drink the milk, but let's say you feed it to one of your pets. You give your dog a bowl of donkey milk. Now you have benefited from that milk that was within the donkey. There's Me'ilah in this case as well, because as we said, when you consecrate something to the Bedek Habayis, it isn't defined strictly by what parts of an animal would be brought on the Mizbeach anymore. Now we're talking about the entire substance of the animal and all that is within it or will be within it. Okay, Mishnah Vav is going to provide us with a series of not so much convoluted, but at a glance, difficult cases where there is not just one factor to what you have consecrated or donated to the Beis Hamikdash. Kol haray lamizbeach v'lo levedek habayis v'lo lamizbeach, lo lamizbeach v'lo levedek habayis, mo'alin bo. Something that is itself able to be brought on the mizbeach, but would be no good donated to the Beis Hamikdash as a general asset, or something that would be useful to the Beis Hamikdash as a general asset, but can't go on the Mizbeach, or something that can't go on either. Nonetheless, it is still possible to violate Me'ilah with respect to those assets, the property of the Beis Hamikdash. So, Ketzad, we'll say what we mean using some illustrative examples. Hiktish bor male mayim, ashpa malea zevel, shovach male yonim, ilan male peros, sada malea asavim, molim behenu b'mash b'sochen. If you consecrate one of these containing areas, a cistern, a compost heap, a coop or a cote for birds to roost, a tree or a field, it is possible to violate Meilah benefiting from them and benefiting from what is within them, the contents. So, for instance, this water that is in the cistern, this is not water that you can bring on the Mizbeach, but you could use it in the Bedek HaBayis. The maintenance workers at the Beis HaMikdash could use it to make plaster, to make clay. So that's an example of Ra'i LeBedek HaBayis V'lo LaMizbeach. The compost heap full of fertilizer, neither the heap nor the fertilizer can be used for the Mizbeach, obviously, and there's nothing to do with them specifically in the funds, the Bedek HaBayis. Rather, you sell them. The money goes to the Beis HaMikdash, the proceeds from selling that compost heap that you pledged. It becomes the value of it, and the fertilizer, the value of it. Similarly, the dovecote with the pigeons can be brought on the Mizbeach, but the actual dovecote is of no use to anybody. There's nothing you could use it for, even in the Bedek HaBayis. The tree that's full of fruit, the fruit itself technically could be offered on the Mizbeach. In other words, the fruit can be made into oil or into wine, which are brought with karbanos, olive oil and wine. As Kati points out, if it's fruit from some other tree, it's not really worth anything to the Mizbeach, nor is it really worth anything to the Bedek HaBayis. It would just be its value. He points out, the Hektish doesn't want to own a tree that will depreciate in value. And again, and the field, you consecrated a field, you could sell the field and you can give the money to the Bedek HaBayis, but this would fall into the category of not ra'ui for the Mizbeach and not ra'ui for Bedek HaBayis. A field full of grass, it's nice to have, but it's not an asset that the Beis HaMikdash can use, and it's not something that can go on a Mizbeach. So in all of these cases, Mo'al and Mehenu B'Masha B'Socha, not only can you violate Me'ilah for the ones that are able to be used directly, but you can violate Me'ilah with respect to any of these things and any of the contents, because the ones that are unfit for use in the Bedek HaBayis and unfit to be brought in the Mizbeach can always be sold and have the money used for either the altar or for temple maintenance. Aval in hikdish bor ba'achar kach nismali mai. Ashba ba'achar kach nismala zeba. Shovach ba'achar kach nismali yonah. Elon ba'achar kach nismali perus. Sada ba'achar kach nismala asavim. Mo'alin b'hem ve'ein mo'alin b'masha b'sochan dever Rabbi Yehuda. So the first opinion presented in these sets of cases is that of Rabbi Yehuda, who believes that if you consecrate a source or an area, like a cistern or a garbage dump area, or a dovecote with nothing in it, or a tree that has no fruit on it, or a field that's empty, and then they produce or become filled up with things. The cistern gets filled with water, the compost heap gets full of fertilizer, the dovecote fills up with doves, the tree fills up with fruit, the field fills up with grasses. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, the only way to violate Me'ilah is to benefit from the real estate or the tree itself, let's say, the shovach itself, the dovecote itself, because that was what was consecrated. That which was within them was not consecrated because it came later on. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon disagrees about two of those cases, the case of a field that produces grasses and a tree that produces fruit, because he believes part of consecrating something that will produce gidulim, something that will produce crops for Hekdesh, is that Hekdesh will own the crops. So in those two cases, he says it is possible to still commit Me'ilah with respect to the grasses and the fruit, because they were produced by Hekdesh real estate, Hekdesh property. Now we come to a couple of cases that deal with an animal that has been consecrated and bears offspring, and the offspring needs to nurse from the mother animal. but the mother animal is Kanshe Hashem. So first we have Vlad Useres, an animal that was selected as Maaser Behema and then gave birth to a baby animal. Lo Yinak ben Useres, Va'acherim Misnadbim came. By the letter of the law, this animal is not allowed to nurse from the mother because the milk is Kadshe Hashem and you're not allowed to benefit from it. However, Va'acherim Misnadbim came. Some people make sure to include a clause when they are consecrating their Maaser Behema to say this animal is Maaser Behema, not its milk. Its milk should remain chulin, so that the child should be able to nurse with no problem. Similarly, Vlad Mukdashin, the offspring of an animal that was consecrated as a karban, lo yinak min hamukdashin. By the letter of the law, that offspring animal should not nurse from the mother animal because the mother animal is Kadshe Hashem and its milk is Kadshe Hashem. However, some people make sure to include this clause that the milk should remain chulin so that the offspring will not have a problem nursing from the mother animal. Finally, hapoalim lo yochlu migrogro shel hekdesh. Workers who are engaged in work on behalf of hekdesh are not supposed to just take their lunch from the food, from the dried fruits that are properties of hekdesh. Says Kahati, afilu hitznu shemazono seyem ala hekdesh. Even if it was a part of their employment with hekdesh, that it's stipulated that hekdesh will provide them with the means to eat lunch while they're at work. Einam ochlam mipeir shel hekdesh ela hagizbar nosein lahem debei mazono seyem. Nonetheless, even if Hekdesh is paying for their food, Hekdesh should pay for it in cash, and they buy their lunch at the shops. They don't go to Hekdesh itself, even if Hekdesh owes them money for lunch. Para lo tochal mikarshine Hekdesh. Similarly, if you have a cow working to thresh grain or to do other work at Hekdesh's headquarters, it's doing work for you for Bedek Habayis. While it's doing this, normally you wouldn't be allowed to muzzle that animal. Lo tachsom shor b'disho, an animal that is threshing for you is not supposed to be prevented from nibbling, taking its fill while it's doing this work. However, take a look at Kahati v'darshu b'dayisha ro'ilo lo tachsom avalatachosim piv b'dayisha lekdish. It says, do not muzzle a shore b'disho. It's doing this, right? But if it is doing this on behalf of Hekdesh, Dayishal Hekdesh, not Disho, therefore it is permitted and in fact required to not allow this cow to have any of the property of Hekdesh while it is threshing. Sharshe Elon Shel Hedyot Bain Vishel Hekdesh, Vishel Hekdesh Bain Vishel Hedyot, Lo Nen and Velo Molet. Here we have two adjacent plots of land. And either the roots of a tree owned by a commoner, those roots grow into the field real estate of Hekdesh, or you had a tree in the field of Hekdesh and its roots encroached now onto the real estate of the field owned by the commoner. So in that case, you are not supposed to benefit from this root that's in the Hekdesh zone, or from the Hekdesh root that's in the common zone. But if you do benefit from them, you do not violate Meilah. So there's two ways to read this line in the Mishnah, and I'll give you both of them. We'll go straight to Kahati right away. So, first possibility. This is Rashi in the Bartanura. Hamaya novea mitoch sadeh chulin v'nimshach v'yotze v'over b'toch sadeh shel Hekdesh. You have a spring that is located, its source is located in a field that is owned by commoners, and then it continues and the stream flows through a field of Hekdesh. Then in that case, you're not supposed to benefit from the water of the spring while it is in this Hekdesh zone. The other way to read this line, which is the Tiveris Yisrael, v'yesh mefarshim afilu b'mayan hanovea mitoch sadeh Hekdesh uchugon shehikdesh es hasada v'lo hikdesh es hamayim. There's another possible reading. Let's say you consecrated the field, but you did not consecrate the spring that was in it. So now we have a non-hekdesh spring that's totally located within a hekdesh field. So in that reading as well, the din is you are not supposed to benefit from the water, but since the mayan is not itself hekdesh, you don't violate Meilah if you did benefit. If you have the stream, even if it's from a spring that was hekdesh, now the stream goes on its way and it's in a field 5 fields over, it's in someone else's land. Now you are allowed to use that water because there is no concern even of benefiting from it without violating hekdesh. Okay, now we're going to talk about on Sukkot, where we do Nisa Chamayim, we do the water pouring offering. So there's two different kalim, two different vessels that are going to be relevant here. One is what you use to collect the water, and the other one is what you use to offer the water. So first they gather the water up in a golden pitcher. So when you gather up the water in this initial golden vessel, but you have not put it yet in the klishares, in the Beis Hamikdash's service vessel. So at that point, you're not supposed to benefit from the water. But if you did, you don't violate Me'ilah because they're not hekdesh yet. However, once they are put in the tzloches, the klishares, the service vessel of the Beis Hamikdash, at that point, ma'alin bahen, if you benefit from the water at that point, you have now benefited from Kodshei Hashem. Arava, on Sukkot, they also would bring in very tall willow branches and lean them all around the Mizbeach. So those aravos that are brought in, lo nahanin v'lo mo'alin, you shouldn't benefit from them because they are doing a mitzvah for the Beis Hamikdash right now. It's like being hekdesh. Even Gati will say, it says here, doma hi lahekdesh. However, v'lo mo'alin, there is no actual kedusha to it, and so you don't violate Me'ilah. Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Tzadok Omer Nosten Hayumimana Zakanin Bilulvei. Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Tzadok brings an attestation that what actually occurred was that before the aravas were set up against the sides of the Mizbeach, people would take some of the arava branches and use them in their lulavim right then and there. Kain Shibrosha Ilan Shel Hekdesh Lo Nahanin V'Lo Mo'alin Shiba Sheira Yatis Bakan. What if a bird builds a nest in your tree that you've consecrated to Hekdesh? Hekdesh owns the tree, but it doesn't own the bird's nest, and you want the bird or you want the eggs. So, l'chatchila, there's an iser d'Rabbana. There's a rabbinic prohibition to benefit from that bird's nest because maybe you'll benefit from some of the twigs that are still attached to the tree. However, let's say you somehow obtain this bird's nest by chance. If you do benefit from that, you are not in violation of Me'ilah because the bird's nest itself is not actually hekdesh. However, if a bird builds a nest in a tree that has been consecrated to Avodah Zarah, where you have to be careful not to derive benefit even by climbing the tree to get the bird's nest. In that case, if you want to get the contents of the bird's nest, you should use a pole to get the bird's nest out of the tree without climbing the tree. If you consecrate a forest, then everything in the forest, the whole contents, the trunks and the branches and the leaves and every single part of that orchard or forest are subject to the possibility of violating Me'ilah. However, agents of the hekdesh that go to purchase wood for the Beis Hamikdash, for construction at the Beis Hamikdash. So in that case, mo'alin ba'etzim, it's possible to violate Me'ilah with respect to the actual wood that's going to be used for beams. Ve'ein mo'alin lo ba'shipur v'lo ba'nviyah. But as you process this wood that you've purchased from the wood supplier, if there's sawdust that falls on the ground, if there's, residual branches and leaves that become debris as you're dealing with this wood. There's no din of Me'ilah with any of those things because they are not the physical substance of what was purchased to be used for the benefit of hekdesh. We'll take Kahati's description here. Hagizbarim lo kanu lehekdesh ela davar harai lebinyan v'lo shibu yunavia. The only thing that they purchased for was building materials. So what they purchased goes under the category of building materials. The sawdust and whatever other debris might result from that purchase is not hekdesh, and so you don't violate me'ilah with respect to it. Animals that are consecrated to be brought on the base in the Beis Hamikdash on the Mizbeach are subject to me'ilah if you benefit from them in the amount of 1 penny, 1 pruta, and you are in violation of consuming pigul, misintended carbon, nosar, a leftover carbon, or eating a carbon in a state of impurity if you eat an olive's worth, a kazayas. Both of these shiurim, a pruta and a kazayas, can be made up with more than one item. So for instance, if you benefit half of a pruta worth from one animal that's consecrated and half of a pruta worth from another animal that's consecrated, you violated me'ilah. If you eat half a kazayat worth from one animal's pigul and half a kazayat from a different animal that's pigul, those combine to make you in violation of the rule against eating pigul. So this is a general statement that we're making, that these shiurim are mitztarfin. These amounts can combine to get you to the level where you're in violation. If you get 1/2 pruta's worth of benefit from an object owned by the Beis Hamikdash, so you drink from a cup owned by the Beis Hamikdash, if you get half a pruta worth of value from that cup, and then you pick up a different Beis Hamikdash cup and you drink, you get half a pruta worth of value from that. Those two combine to the amount of a pruta, and you are in violation of me'ilah. Finally, also, the consecrated items of the assets of the Beis Hamikdash can combine with the consecrated animals to be brought on the Mizbeach in terms of benefiting partially from each of them to reach the total of a pruta. Let's just review this quickly using Gati's language. If you benefit from the flesh of an animal intended for the Mizbeach, but you benefit less than the shiur, less than the amount of a pruta, and you benefit as well from the meat of an animal that was consecrated simply to Berek Habayis, simply to be property of the Beis Hamikdash, that also, it was less than the amount that you would be in violation. The half a pruta benefit you got from the carbon and the half a pruta benefit you got from the animal that was property of Berek Habayis, they do combine to make you be in violation of me'ilah. Why is this line in the Mishnah missing the line about pigul nosar and tame that we had in the first part of the Mishnah? Because there's no such thing as those violations when it's simply property of the Beis Hamikdash and not intended for the altar. We're now going to continue with the discussion of combining to make a shiur to violate me'ilah. So when it comes to an ola, which is completely burned except for the skin, which goes to the kohanim, Hamisha dvarim ba'ola mitztarfin zeh. You can violate me'ilah with a total of a pruta's worth of benefit from across all 5 of these aspects of the ola. That would be habasar, v'hachela, v'hasolas, v'hayayin, v'hashemen. The meat of the ola, the forbidden fats of the ola, the flour and oil of the mincha that is offered with the ola, and the wine that is poured along with the ola. Similarly, v'shisha batoda. The same 5 things apply to a Thanksgiving offering, with one additional one: habasar, v'hachela, v'hasolas, v'hayayin, v'hashemen, v'halechem. By Karban Toda, there is meat that is holy. There is forbidden fats that are going to be burned on the Mizbeach. There's a mincha that's composed of flour and oil. There's a wine offering, and there is also a bread offering. And if you benefit from any of those and it totals one pruta of benefit, you are in violation of Me'ilah. Hatruma, Isumas Maser, Shaldamai, Hachala, Habikurim, Mitzdarfim Zanza, Lasor, Ulachai Balei Mesachosh. Here we're going to have a list of things that have the status of truma. Things that have the status of truma all combine to create one pruta's worth of benefit, to put you in violation of Me'ilah and to require you to pay back the principal plus a chomesh. What are these things? Well, first, we have regular truma. You derive impermissible benefit from truma less than the amount of a pruta. Trumas Maser is the special truma that the Levi takes from the Maser that you give him, right? You give the Levi a tenth, and the Levi gives some portion of that, tenth of a tenth, to the Kohen, and that also has the status of truma. The Trumas Maser that comes from Demai is grain that was purchased from an Ama Aretz, a person who's not trusted confidently to have taken tithes properly. The Trumas Maser from that still has the status of truma. In addition, the challah that you take when you are making dough, that is also referred to as truma in the pasuk. And bikurim, the first fruits offering that starts on Shavuos. Also, there's a drasha we say about trumas yadecha, and we say about the bikurim he takes the basket from your hand directly. And so we darshan that bikurim also have the status of truma. Therefore, all of these things that have the status of truma can cross-combine with one another to create a value of a pruta such that if you derive that value, you now are in violation of Me'ilah. Similarly, kol hapigulad mitzdarfin zeh. Pigel from one kind of animal, pigel from a different kind of animal, pigel from one kind of carbon, pigel from a different kind of carbon, they combine. If you eat a kazayit total, you're chayav kares on purpose, you're chayav rachatas b'shogeg, whatever. You violate pigel if you combine to that kazayas, even if you didn't eat a full kazayas from one animal's pigel. Similarly, kol anosarim mitzdarfin zanzeh. A half a kazayas from this leftover carbon, a half a kazayas from this leftover carbon, they combine to make a kazayas to make you chayav in violating eating nosar. For the next two examples, we're going to have two-pronged discussions. There's going to be eating and there's going to be impurity. Kol hanavelos mitzdarfos zomzo, kol ashratzon mitzdarfon zemzeh. So for nevelas, there's two issues. The carcass of a dead kosher animal and the carcass of a dead non-kosher animal both impart impurity if you touch or move them. For those purposes, you could have a piece of one and a piece of the other, and they would combine to the shiur of a kazayas to make you impure. However, there is a separate shame, a separate category to the prohibition of eating a dead non-kosher animal and eating an improperly slaughtered kosher animal, a nevela. And so for the purposes of eating, unlike what we said about pigel and nosar, for the purposes of eating, a nevela of a kosher animal and a nevela of a non-kosher animal do not combine. It would have to be pieces of multiple kosher nevelas. Those would combine for the purposes of achila. Similarly, we have two prongs to the question of a sheretz. There is the impurity side and there's the eating side. Let's read this one directly from Kahati. All of the creepy crawlies can combine together in the sense that someone who eats a total of a kazayit from all of them together is obligated to be stricken with lashes. Furthermore, the 8 specified shiratzim that are listed in the Torah that cause tuma, that cause impurity, those can also combine together to cause impurity after their death. This amount is the amount of a lentil, a single adasha. So if you happen to have a piece of one of those shratzim that's less than an adasha and another piece that completes the shiur adasha, they do combine together to make you impure. The same le'inyan achila. Similar to what we said about nevela, if you eat the shiur, which in this case is an adasha, not a kazayas, if you eat that combined for multiple of the eight shiratzim, you are obligated in lashes. The same amount that makes you impure and the same way that they can combine to make you impure is the same amount and the same mechanism by which they can make you obligated for lashes if you eat them, a combination of them. The Mishnah adds here, Dam hasheretzu saro mitzdarf. The flesh and blood of one of these eight shiratzim combine to make you tameh. There's a machlokas here. What does this mean? The Rambam says this means blood that is in the flesh of the sheretz can combine with it to make the shiur of an adasha. Rashi says we're talking about blood that's separate from a piece of sheretz, but is with it and does it combine to make a shiur. Rashi says it does. Now Rabbi Yoshua is going to give us a rubric, a system for figuring out which things combine and which things do not to put you in violation of these rules. Klal Amar Rabbi Yoshua, Kol shetumas over shiuro shavin, mitzdarfin zamzeh. Things that impart the same level of tuma and things that require the same amount to be triggered, the violation to be triggered, those can combine with one another. He gives the example of one sheretz with another sheretz, one nevela with another nevela. All of those things that are equivalent in those ways can combine. All of the nevelas combine, all of the shretzim combine. But tumasov lo shiuro, Kahati gives the example here, if you have a nevela and a sheretz, they impart the same kind of tumah, but they are not subject to the same shiur. The nevela is a kazayas and the sheretz is an adasha. Shiuro v'lo tum'aso. For this, we have an example of a dead human body and a dead animal carcass that wasn't properly slaughtered. Both of them make you tameh with a kazayas, but the tum'ah of the nevela is different from the more stringent tum'ah of the dead body. Lo tumaso v'lo shiuro, or if you have a dead human body and a sheretz, where they're completely different in what kind of tumah they give you and the amount that it takes for it to occur. Ein mitzdarfin zamzeh. So all of these cases where you have a disjunction between the amount that it takes and what the effect is, they can't combine. The ones where the effect and the amounts are equivalent, they can combine. As mentioned, things that are in different categories of violation cannot combine with one another. So if you eat half a kazayit of improperly intended carbon and half a kazayit of leftover carbon, you have not violated a kazayit worth of either one. This is an expansion on what we said at the end of the previous Mishnah for Rabbi Yoshua. The flesh of a sheretz and a nevela, which are different shiurim, can't combine even to the lesser shiur. So it doesn't matter if you have a hadasha that you made up with just a little bit of nevela. It doesn't combine. The same hanevelo b'sar mace, if you have a piece of kosher animal that was not properly slaughtered, but not a kazayas, and you have a piece of a dead human body, but not a kazayas, they do not combine to make you tameh, even to the level of the lesser one. You might think, okay, the impurity of a dead body is more stringent than the impurity of a nevela, so we'll take that which is contained in the more stringent one. Where they overlap, you might think is on this lesser level of tumah, but no, we do not combine those two different types of tumah to give you the lesser one. Now the Mishnah is going to give us an example where something like this does happen, although it is a different kind of situation. If you have some food that was made impure by being touched by a top level impure object, and it is now a degree 1 impure food, it's a rishon l'tumah. You have some other food that's not quite a shiur, that was affected by a degree one impure object, and now it is a sheni latuma, a degree two impure food. Mitzarfin zem zelatame kakal shebishnehem. We do in fact combine those to say now that you have a shiur that can impart sheni latova, degree two level impurity. So, for instance, if you have this combination, you have half a kazayit of rishon latuma food and half a kazayit of sheni latuma food, and then that combination touches some truma. That truma is now a shlishi latuma, not a sheni latuma. They combined those two partial shiurim combined to create the lesser of the two impurity levels that was present. So, whereas in the previous situation, they don't combine at all, in this situation, they do combine and they produce the result that you follow the lesser impurity that is present. Kola ochlin mitzvah, foods all combine. Here's some examples. Lifsolas hakvia b'kachatzi pras, someone who has eaten half of a loaf half, so let's say a quarter loaf or the amount of a quarter loaf of bread of impure food is no longer permitted to eat truma. His body, as it were, is forbidden from eating truma. So it can be a half a pras of any impure foods, one handful of impure peanuts, one handful of impure raspberries. It doesn't matter. They all combine as impure foods to add up to kachatzi pras to make you not able to eat truma anymore at that time. Bimazon shtei seudos la'erav. When you're making an erev tchumen to enable you to walk further than 2,000 amos in a certain direction outside of your city on Shabbos, you need to put at the spot that you are adjoining your new tchum, you need to put the amount for 2 meals. And our Mishnah is telling us that those 2 meals can be a combination of any amount of food that makes up the requisite total. It can be as many items, they all combine. The person who eats foods that are tameh becomes tameh if they amount to the volume of an egg, and that volume can be accomplished by combining any and all foods. Shabbos, the violation of carrying outside on Shabbos without an Erev for foodstuffs, the shiur is a dried fig, and it can be a dried fig worth of any variety of different foods combined together. The volume for eating on Yom Kippurim is not the volume of a dried fig, but it's that of a dried date. And again, in this situation, all of those can combine to create the requisite shiur. Kolam ashkin mitzdarfin lifsolas hakavia baravias uvim lo lugmav b'yom Kippur. Similarly, all beverages combine. If you drink a revius log of impure beverages, this, similarly to the first case in the Mishnah, makes it so you're not allowed to eat truma at that time. And any impure beverages can combine to cause this effect. Similarly, drinking beverages on Yom Kippur, a mouthful, a cheekful, that violation is triggered with any combination that amounts to the shiur. So there is a rule about the fruit of a tree the first 3 years in Eretz Yisrael, and that the fruit that it produces for the first 3 years is prohibited. Similarly, if you plant grains, vegetables, or legumes in a vineyard, a kerem, you also are prohibited to eat that produce. Normally, we would say if a certain amount of any of that, which happens to be 1 unit in anything less than 200 units, we would say a barrel of Arla produce mixed in with less than 200 barrels of non-Arla, it renders the mixture completely prohibited. You would also say, similarly, if you have 1 barrel of kilei akarem that's mixed in with less than 200 barrels of non-kilei akarem produce, the whole mixture is prohibited. But let's say you have a half a barrel of Arla and a half a barrel of kilei akarem, and they're mixed together, and now that enters a mixture of less than 200. In that case, they combine together to prohibit all of those in the mixture. We'll just review this again very quickly in Kahati's language. You have a single sa'ah unit quantity that's composed of both of these, Arla and Kileakar, and it falls into less than 200 sa'ah quantity of that which is permitted. Harezo oseres osan. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Einon mitzarfin. Rabbi Shimon says they do not combine. Rabbi Shimon believes that Arla and Keleakarim are Shnei Shemos. As we said, he believes they are far enough apart, they are two distinct categories, and they cannot combine. So now we're going to have a discussion of various textile type objects which become eligible to become tameh by being leaned on or moved, tameh midras, by a zav. And we'll see they have different shiurim, but they can combine. Let's read specifically along with us in Kahati because he's going to give us the details. Habeged, a woven garment, sheshiuro kadei lekabel tumas midras hazav kisheyesh bo shlosha al shlosha tvachim. The shiur that a garment has to be to become tameh midras by a zav is 3 by 3 handbreadths, and to become tameh from all of the other standard normal everyday types of tuma, the amount that it has to be is 3 fingers by 3 fingers. Anything smaller than that, it cannot acquire that ritual impurity. The hasak, this is burlap, sackcloth. Its shiur for both of those purposes, both for general tuma and for tumas midras, is 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim. So you have a piece of cloth and a piece of sackcloth. They have different shiurim. Or if you have hasak v'ha'or, you have a piece of sackcloth and you have a piece of leather hide. The leather hide's shiur is 5 tvachim by 5 tvachim. So now you have 2 more pieces who have different amounts for their shiur to be eligible to become tameh. Or if you have a mapetz, you have a piece of leather and you have a piece of woven mat, a reed mat. Its shiur to acquire tuma is 6 tvachim by 6 tvachim. So just like we said previously that sometimes you can combine things lakal shebenehem, the lesser amount that they that exists, the lesser amount that would trigger the effect. So in this case, Kati says, for instance, habeged mitzarif lasakli tamei rak sheyesh v'arba tvachim al arba tvachim. Normally, a beged would only need 3 by 3 tvachim to become able to be impure. But since we're combining it here with a piece of sock, it has to get you to the quantity of 4 by 4 in total. Similarly, the piece of sackcloth and the piece of hide can combine only if they reach 5 by 5, and the piece of hide and the mat can combine to a shiur only if they reach 6 by 6. Kati points out this is not the case in reverse. You can't have a little bit of sackcloth to finish off the 3 by 3 of a beged to enable it to become tameh. You can't have a little bit of hide to finish off the sackcloth, etc., etc. I'm sorry. You only go to the one that has the higher requirement, which would be the less stringent situation, right? It's more stringent if it takes less for this to become tameh. Rabbi Shimon Omer Mipnei Shehin Ru'in Litamei Moshav. Rabbi Shimon says, even though we learned few Mishnahs ago in Mishnah Gimel that if things do not have a similar shiur, they're not supposed to combine. We just got done saying the baguette it's 3 by 3, the sock it's 4 by 4, the hide is 5 by 5, the mapates it's 6 by 6. Nonetheless, mikol makom we will read mikol makom elu mitzarfin lefisha betuma achas mitumos hazav shiuram shava. In one shiur, in one respect, in one dimension, their parameters the same, which is that any of these, if even a single handbreadth by a single handbreadth was cut out of them and was used by the Zav as a place to sit, they all are eligible to become Tameh because of Moshav Zav at that shiur. And so Rabbi Shimon says the fact that they share this ability to become Tameh in this way, in that shared shiur, lets them combine as well for the purposes of other tumas. We'll pick back up again next week with chapter 5 and chapter 6.